Hi, this is Kim Eierman from EcoBeneficial, bringing you more useful gardening tips to help improve our environment. Today I have the pleasure of interviewing Ron Determann. Ron is the Vice President of Conservatories at the Atlanta Botanical Garden, a place that I had the pleasure of visiting very recently, and I was so impressed with some of the conservation efforts there that I invited Ron to do an interview. So welcome, Ron.
Good morning. How's it going?
Terrific.
Good.
And Ron, I understand you've got a long history at Atlanta Botanical Garden. How long have you been there, and what is your focus?
Well, I have been at the garden from the groundbreaking of the Fuqua Conservatory on, so since 1987, so now 27 years. So it's a long time, and I've helped develop the program in the conservatory, so the plant collections and the focus in the plant collections policy that's pertinent to those facilities. And then I had the great opportunity in 2002 also to head up and start and help with the design of the Fuqua Orchid Center, which is basically an addition to our conservatory complex here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we now have about 44,000 square foot under glass, and that includes some of our backup facilities. And it really has always had a very integrated approach of conservation, whether it's native or tropical or anything else, to our program. So, and that has also been the focus of some of our conservation and bog gardens that we have outside. So they're really pertinent to our outreach program and the program whereby we are growing plants for recovery work or safeguarding and things like that. So that's kind of been the focus of my work here and the development of the program. So,
well, based on what I saw, you've done a fantastic job. What really caught my eye, because it's very unusual to find at a public garden, are your series of native bog gardens featuring pitcher plants and some other indigenous species. And a lot of folks may not know what a bog is. So could you tell us a little bit about bogs, what they are and why they're important?
Yeah, well, this is always a very confusing concept, what a bog is. And frequently people see those as being stagnant, puddles that hold water for a length of time. And the types of bogs that we work with are very, very specialized bogs. They're basically pitcher plant bogs, and frequently they're hillside, seep communities, plant communities. So there's continuous water available to the plants, and the plants stay wet all the time. But it is not a stagnant kind of a community, And what we've done basically in our bogs, we've basically embraced the concept which we've called ecotonal gardening, whereby essentially specific little micro-ecotones are getting created through the use of a liner and the appropriate soils, etc., to hold this plant community and basically mimic this wild plant community. Mm-hmm. And normally this community, as you would find it in the wild, is sort of on an ecotone, maybe between an upland community and a more stagnant or floodplain community. And water constantly seeps through there. And this, basically transitional zone is referred to in the wild as an ecotone. And these ecotones are very, very specialized. So they have very unique plants and animals and everything that live in these plants, in these communities. And that's kind of what we concentrated on.
No.
And it's
I'm sorry. Most of these bog plants are requiring things like acidic soil and full sun. Is that right? Constant moisture. What are some of the elements that are required?
Yes. Well, they're plant communities that are basically nutrient poor. And the nice thing about these nutrient poor communities, they're plants that are adapted to that. So, for instance, carnivorous plants that basically capture and digest alternative means of food. Instead of plant food, they capture insects, digest them, and take that up as plant food. So that's kind of what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And they are as acidic soils in general, but they still have very specialized nutrients and stuff like that available to the plants just at the right volume and the right levels for these plants to thrive. Mm-hmm. So frequently they're very sandy, and then they have a layer of organic matter overlaying that. And in that interface is where these plants hover.
Okay, and we've just mentioned pitcher plants. What are some other plants that one might find in these native bogs that you have displayed?
Well, there are many native orchids that are in the same kind of plant communities, and that's another focus, obviously, of our collections here, such as all kinds of bog orchids that are there, Platantras and Pogonias and Calopogons, to just name a few, grass pink and, things like that. So
And they're pretty spectacular.
they're fantastic. And when they do their thing, like especially, when our bogs come into bloom with hundreds and hundreds of specimens of these plants, it is absolutely striking, really so. And the nice, concept of this, what I've called ecotonal gardening, is that it is not just a plant, an individual plant or an individual set of plant that comes to fruition at one time, but it is a whole plant community that comes kind of in waves of their optimization. So, we may have a wave of liatras all coming in bloom, or daisies, or pitcher plants, or orchids, etc. So wave after wave, and it's a sort of an integrated approach. So it's not that these plants are in a specific pocket that just depicts where this particular orchid comes into bloom. No, these are throughout the bogs, and that's what we're trying to depict. And that's obviously also how you find them in nature. So it is basically mimicking nature a little bit, and giving us a better connectivity and a better appreciation of our natural environment.
And hopefully encourages homeowners to start thinking about plant communities, not just individual plants, because obviously plants are not growing in isolation.
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, and that can really help with support of pollinators and wildlife and all those type of things. So
when I was visiting your bog gardens, I came across some tourists from Australia, and they had no idea what they were looking at when they were looking at the pitcher plants. And I pointed out all the insects that were trapped inside, and they were a bit horrified. But it's fascinating and certainly enticing for children. So talk a little bit about how the insects interact with these plants and what the process is.
Yeah, well, the pitcher plants have a great specialization. They give off actually fragrance, and also color and shape, as well as they have a reward in the form of a nectar, that basically sugars that are forming around the lids and the peristome, the rim of the pitchers. So therefore insects get lured, and by eating that nectar they actually become drowsy and disoriented and actually fall into the pitchers. And then there are liquids in these pitchers, that basically make them sink through the water tension and surface, and then they get attacked by enzymes that occur in those pitchers, and they get digested and taken up as plant food. So it's a great adaptation of plants towards living in these nutrient-poor environments and being able to cope with it by finding alternative sources of food.
How long does it take an insect to be digested by these enzymes?
Well, that depends a lot, on what kind of insect it is. The small little flies and things like that actually, fall apart within, just days of them drowning. But then the harder bodies of beetles or, bees and things like that might take a much longer period of time. So, and it's kind of neat also to see that some of the pitcher plants, like the white-top pitcher plants and things like that, will actually send up a specific flush in the fall to basically cash in on the insects that are basically active during that time of year. So the white-top pitcher plant in the fall sends up new pitchers to catch moths, which are prominent in our landscape. And if you open these pitchers up, you see all these different layers of insects that have accumulated over time in the pitchers. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
The only other thing I can think is so important that we basically, these bog gardens and plants and even container gardens, they could be such a good boost for the conservation also of pollinators in our environment, So I think that's another very important aspect that we can highlight. So if you see, our insects coming to the garden and where they are, as opposed to in our, more ephemeral plantings, they really love our bog gardens because they find everything there, water and obviously nectar sources and everything else. So pollinators are another very important focus, and people with their own bog gardens can do a lot to preserve those,
Now, there are obviously a lot of these pollinators that they go in, but they don't come out.
Well, that's true, but at the same time, there's so many plants that they also benefit from. So by having a large enough setup for that, their benefits probably outweigh their being captured here and there by a pitcher plant. You know what I mean?
I
So,
noticed
yeah.
something kind of interesting. It seemed like the bees were not as bright as the wasps. Man, maybe this was just a casual observation, but I noticed the wasps were very much more careful walking around the perimeter of the pitcher plants, and the bees kind of, jumped in.
Yeah. I
Have you
think you're
noticed that?
absolutely right. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it is ironic that actually some of the larger bumblebees, they bite their way out again. So
Do they?
Yeah, they eat their nectar, they get disoriented, they sag into the pitcher, and then they, somehow reawaken if they're on top, and then they gnaw a hole in the side of the pitcher plant and fly right out. If they're strong enough to do it.
That's
So
fantastic.
others get digested, obviously, but it's a bit of survival of the fittest, obviously. But it's kind of an interesting concept. We have right now probably hundreds of pitcher plants that have big holes in the side of them, where the bumblebees basically bit their way out again.
Good for them.
Yeah. So, and you're right. Wasps are very very astute. They just eat the nectar from the rims and then fly off and use it probably. But there's very few that actually sag in there, especially certain genera of wasps. So they just come to feed. So I think it has a great pollinator benefit. That's kind of the bottom line.
And
Yeah.
pitcher plants are referred to as Sarracenia, correct?
Yes, in the southeast here, our pitcher plants are all in the genus Sarracenia, and there's about depending on who you believe, 8 or 11 species of Sarracenia, and 3 of those are federally listed endangered species.
Really?
Yeah. So the green pitcher plant, Alabama or canebrake pitcher plant, as well as the mountain sweet pitcher plants, are federally listed endangered species.
Wow. That's quite a ratio.
Yeah.
And so, hence the importance of conservation efforts for these threatened habitats and these threatened plants.
Yeah, it's very important, and it's obviously a very important focus. And that kind of connects our display bogs with the work that we're doing in terms of working on restoration, conservation, and safeguarding of these endangered species. And most of the populations that are left of these federally endangered species are also in captivity here in ex situ conservation at the garden, so for long-term safeguarding. And we have a nursery in Gainesville, Georgia, where we have little communities set up, much like our little bogs here, but like more in 4x8 beds that safeguard those individual plants from those populations.
And are these plants easy to propagate or no?
Well, not the easiest. They have to be grown from seed, and we have obviously over the years developed a very successful protocol on doing that and growing them on, and then being able to plan them out either for recovery and restoration work in the wild or for safekeeping here at the garden, or integration in our display bogs, really. So.
And I understand that pitcher plants require a cold resting period, a dormant period.
Yes, yeah, consistent with our climate here, and the northern species, obviously, in your area, like the purple pitcher plants and things like that, require a longer dormancy than the ones here in the southeast. Yeah, in the southeast, they don't really take too much, really. So, and it's interesting, like the dormancy to break their seed for germination is only very limited. So, in 4 to 5 weeks, cold stratification of the seed and surface sowing it, the seed breaks its dormancy once you bring it into the higher temperatures, and then readily germinates. So. Okay. Yeah.
And I noted that you actually have 6 different bogs: the coastal plain bog, the Georgia bog, Alabama bog, Western Gulf Coast bog, fall line bog, and then a hybrid bog, which is not native. But could you just speak a little bit about these different types of bogs?
Yeah. Well, these are basically bogs that hold representatives that we can find in those type of communities. So a mountain bog would be something. It's a very, very rare and probably the most threatened plant community in Georgia, the rarest plant community in Georgia. We only have a couple of them in our mountains that have actually pitcher plants growing in it. So we have representatives of these bogs planted around the plants with those pitcher plants as well.
And some of those plants might be what?
Well, they could be things like Halonius, another endangered plant in Halonius palata, is called swamp pink, and let's see what else. There could be, rare cotton grass growing in them or things like that,
Okay.
and lots of other sedges and other things, and even flowering plants of various kinds that grow in those plant communities. And we have some representatives of that as well. And of course, the southeastern, Gulf Coast bog will have the species from our Gulf Coast, so more like Panhandle, Florida, and places like that, And, a fall line bog would be something as we encounter in the fall line, which is basically the zone whereby we go from the Piedmont to the coastal plain, that transitional zone. And they have very unique plant representatives in those communities. And it includes pitcher plant bogs and Atlantic white cedar and things like that. So we have some representatives of that as well. And the final bog you mentioned was the hybrid bog. And that's basically, our garden actually holds what we call the National Collection of Sarracenia, the NAPCC. And that's from the National Plant, it's APGA. It's a collections approach towards holding specific specialized collections of plants. And that includes a lot of horticultural varieties of plants and things like that. So that's sort of an enhancement, and it's more of an educational component of our bogs, and to basically show the beauty and the ornamental value of pitcher plants as well. So
now, what are the greatest threats to natural bogs?
Well, I believe and it's something that is becoming more and more aware of now, is that I think the rampant use of herbicide and indiscriminate use of herbicide in the southeast has probably led to the most loss of bogs, and it's more the quality of the bogs. Very few plant communities don't get doused with herbicides, and it's both in forestry, in transitional zones between agriculture. A lot of roadsides are being sprayed right away, pipelines, transmission lines, etc. And a lot of these, pieces of land hold bogs, and they're frequently the only open communities left. But now, with the great advance of using all these herbicides in those areas, these plant communities have all but disappeared. So I think that is probably the greatest loss of all of it. And the second greatest loss, I think, is that in forestry, we've become so aggressive in just growing those crop species of trees that we want to grow, like pine trees here in the southeast, loblolly pines. And we have now used wholesale granular herbicides in these forests that have basically obliterated all the biodiversity in those areas, and that includes those bogs, So I think those are the biggest threats. And of course, then there is, wetland loss,
development,
and all those other things. But they're probably, in terms of volume, limited compared to what we lose in terms of quality of bogs all throughout the southeast.
So if a homeowner or even a business thinks they might have a bog on their land, what would they be looking for that might give them a clue?
Well, first of all, it's obviously very important to do an inventory, a plant inventory, what you find in such a bog. And if pitcher plants are present, or sundews and things like that, well, then the likelihood that you have a bog is very great, obviously. But inventory work, so identifying the types of plants they have growing in those plant communities, is going to be crucial to them figuring out whether they have a bog or not,
And Atlanta Botanical Garden, as I understand, you have a plant hotline, correct?
Yes, yeah, we do.
So someone could actually send you a photo and say, is this a bog plant?
Yes, yeah, we can do that. And then we have a great team of volunteers that can help with that. And occasionally they get stumped on a rare plant or something. And then they usually send it on to one of our staff members, a botanist here, or myself, or whatever. And then we help them identify those plants. And so occasionally we show up some really, really rare plants, for Georgia or for the Southeast, And of course we work throughout the Southeast. We work in North South Carolina, in Alabama, Georgia, Florida, just to name a few states that we're quite active in the bog, community and restoration work. So.
And if you're not fortunate enough to have a remnant of a bog on your own landscape, you can actually have a bog garden, can't you?
Absolutely. And then
tell us how to do that.
Yeah, well, we've done this very artificially here in town, obviously, because first of all, we're in the Piedmont, and we don't have the right kind of soils here, and we obviously don't have the right kind of hydrology for a bog. The bogs you saw here when you visited here, actually on the edge of a hill, that would normally be sort of a, rocky knoll overlooking, the landscape if it was still a natural site, but obviously it isn't. So we have basically from the bottom up created these bogs. And what we did basically is lay down a liner over a dugout area in Georgia, and it's sort of a liner that we sort of put a rippling pattern in as to slow down the horizontal flow of the water. And then on top of that liner we put charcoal and filter fabric and sand, builder sand, and all in a layer of maybe 6 to 8 inches or so. And then on top of that we have basically amended that sand with a organic matter in the form of peat moss and sphagnum moss and things like that to basically be conducive to growing these pitcher plants. And then we started planting in these pitcher plants and the plants that normally associated in those type of communities. And of course we've kept these liners because they are raised up and they are basically slowing down the water percolation only downwards. We also have a source of water on the top part of that liner, and you basically create from the top down sort of a hillside seep effect. And I think that's been part of the success of our bogs here. So it can indeed be accomplished that way. And
so can you illustrate? Can you grow a bog successfully in, say, a large container successfully without that water flow, without that seep?
You can, but it's just like any other kind of gardening and raised pots and potted plants and stuff like that. You would have to repot a little bit more often.
I see.
So unless you set those bowls or those bog bowls or pots or whatever you want up also as a seep, whereby there's basically a source of water and an overflow, or so that the water sort of percolates through these containers. And we've devised various ways of doing that as well. And then you can get some more longevity out of those containerized gardens. But one of the great ways of illustrating bog and bog plants is obviously with containers. And these containers indeed have, sort of a non-permeable surface in the bottom. So you need to make sure you hold enough moisture, and then a layer of sand and a peat and sand on top. And that works real well, especially if you have a live moss interface, etc. Now, the other thing it's very important to keep in mind that your source of water needs to be very good quality. Now, we're blessed here in Atlanta that we have a pretty good source of water that doesn't have a whole lot of calcium in it and things like that. Many other places where people are trying to grow bog plants, their water quality is not very conducive to growing these plants because they, as you mentioned, they need low pH, they need very clean water, etc. If the water is too rich or too calcareous, you get salt accumulations, and that leads to the demise of these plants. They cannot handle that. So,
is it possible to filter your water source in any way to make it more
absolutely.
conducive?
Absolutely. Let's say, for instance, if you would live in Texas, where you have really high calcareous water, very high parts per million, then two things you would have to do probably is take all the hardness out of the water. So then you have to get either through a system whereby you run the water through a water softener, and then beyond the water softener, which is basically replacing all the calcium and magnesium ions all with sodium, and then you need to run it through a filter system, which is quite sophisticated, which is a reverse osmosis system. And then the water that comes out of that is really fine for using in these kind of settings. But water filtration systems would be highly recommended in those kind of settings because the longevity of these bogs is going to be very, very limited.
So test your water first before you start planting a bog.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
And then here at the garden, all we have to do is basically through a carbon filter take the chlorine out in our backup facilities, and we're up and going, no problem. So
I noticed a few container plantings of some other carnivorous plants, like Venus flytraps, etc. Can you talk a little bit about those and how one might be growing those in their own landscape in a container?
Well, again, it's pretty similar setup, So, if you have a bowl that doesn't drain, you put in a layer of liner or something that contains the water, and then you put a layer of charcoal and sand over that, and then on top of the sand you put your moss and your peat moss and sphagnum moss, and then you plant your fly traps in there. And then again, a good source of water, and you're up and running, and that works pretty well. Now again, with containers, you have to repot every couple of years because you still have issues, over time, because it doesn't keep as clean as a hillside seep, like what we've created here, where you really can create a community. And those bogs that you saw here, Kim, have been going for about 12 years now.
Wow.
So.
That's impressive. Well, I think almost every child in America has killed a Venus flytrap.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of it's due to bad water. So that's one thing. Using distilled water on them will be very helpful, or properly filtered water, And then full sun is another absolute requirement. I see a lot of
Full
people
sun.
think, these plants are really, thrive in full sun communities. Really, they cannot be in the shade or on a windowsill or under lamps that are not powerful enough and things like that. So those things really need to be addressed for them to be optimized and to be happy.
And the bog gardens are so striking and so unusual, and I think, again, so enticing as a way to connect kids with nature. I'm going to ask you a really tough question. I find this to be difficult. What are your 3 favorite plants in your bog gardens?
Yeah, it is a good question. Obviously, us choosing carnivorous plants was a very, very deliberate move. I think the director at that time that hired me probably hired me for my knowledge of orchids and carnivorous plants. And I think if I didn't have those, I probably wouldn't be here. So those were some of the groups of plants whereby we really can sell education and things like that and appeal to people that otherwise might not appeal to plants. And what better group is there than the carnivorous plants, So my favorites are carnivorous plants and bog orchids and, and then I have a specialty also on conifers. So
yes, that's right.
Yeah, a lot of endangered conifers on Earth, and it's another flagship specialty of the garden to work with those, both natives and rare plants from places as far away as New Caledonia or Madagascar, places like that. So that's another real specialty of ours, and obviously our tropical conservatories lend themselves well to housing those.
Well, your gardens are beautiful, and you're right in the middle of Atlanta, so it's a testament to the fact that you can grow fabulous gardens in any setting, and you can even have a bog garden in your own yard with the right conditions. So
Absolutely.
I want to thank you so much, Ron, for this wonderful information. Again, Ron Determann from the Atlanta Botanical Garden. He's the Vice President of Conservatories, and I hope that we'll have a chance to speak again, Ron. Thank you so much. This is Kim Eierman from EcoBeneficial. Thanks for watching. For more useful gardening tips to improve our environment, please visit us at www.ecobeneficial.com.